These interviews being done here at the Massachusetts General Hospital are part of the program of the Archives Committee of the American Association of Neurological Surgeons to record for the future the thoughts, the philosophies, the background of some of the leaders in American, not only neurosurgery, but neurology and other neurosciences. I'm Dr. Robert Ojemann. We are here in Boston, Massachusetts at the Massachusetts General Hospital on April 20, 1988. And I have the pleasure today of interviewing Professor Raymond D. Adams, former chief of the neurology service here at the Massachusetts General Hospital, professor of neurology and neuropathology, and one of the leaders in neurology over the last several decades. Dr. Adams, thank you for joining us today.
You're most welcome, Bob.
I thought we might begin by your giving us a little background on yourself, in particular, what were the things that led you to medicine and subsequently into the field of the neurosciences.
Well, my approach was a rather devious one, I fear. I started out as a graduate student in psychology at the University of Oregon and was very much intrigued by a professor of physiological psychology, Crossland, and also by Robert Seashore, who is the son of the famous Seashore of University of Iowa. And I did my master's thesis under Seashore, learned quite a lot about how to do careful research and set up proper controls, and was going on to finish my work for my doctorate in psychology when it occurred to me that I really didn't know a blasted thing about the brain. So I decided to go to medical school on the spur of the moment in the summer of 1933 and was accepted without any references at Duke Medical School and went through that school really with the intent of getting a good background in neuroanatomy and neurophysiology and so forth. And also I thought it might be interesting to look at psychiatry. After finishing 2 years of internal medicine at Duke, I was given a Rockefeller Fellowship for 3 years and came to Mass General and started neurology then.
Was there anything that made you select the Mass General at that point?
Well, it had a good service under Doctors James Jackson Putnam and Taylor and Eyre. Dr. Eyre was then the chief of the service, and so I was sort of propelled in that direction because of these people. I didn't know Charles Kubik before, never heard of him. And I didn't know really Stanley Cobb, except he was a very famous man and was not only chief of psychiatry here with a large research center, but also was the Bullard Professor of Neuropathology and an excellent physiologist.
Quite an unusual combination of
Yes, but
talent.
it was from the era when people were broadly trained. And after spending a year with James Eyre and Charles Kubik and a year with Stanley Cobb, I went to New Haven, where
are we now chronologically?
1940 to 41.
Now, you would have, Dr. Cushing died in 1939, so...
Yes, I never met him. I knew Louise Eisenhardt, who was sort of the curator of the Cushing collection, and I was very close to John Fulton.
He was still active?
John was still active and had a magnificent department of neurophysiology, which was really colored to a great extent by his scholarship and interesting personality. So I had the benefit both of the Kraepelinian School of Psychiatry during that year, and John Fulton's physiology. And Harry Zimmerman was there in neuropathology. So
Quite a group of talented individuals.
And then I was to have gone back to Duke University. I was given a Rockefeller Fellowship on the understanding that I would.
Mm-hmm.
But the possibility of coming to the Boston City Hospital, the Rockefeller Research unit there, came up, and I accepted that to help Houston Merritt.
Now, Denny Brown was...
Denny Brown was not there. He had been selected in September 1939 as professor of neurology and head of that department.
Mm-hmm.
Putnam had retired, or had gone to New York some year before, but the war broke out about 2 weeks after he accepted the appointment. So there was no one there except Houston Merritt and Alexander, Leo Alexander. Alexander went to Duke, and I came to work with Houston and to do neuropathology.
So at that point in time, you'd already developed your interest in neuropathology,
Yes,
which became a predominant interest to you.
Yes, I had worked with a man by the name of Robert Graves at Duke, who had been at the Cahal Institute and at the Montreal Neurological Institute, a very gifted man. And I learned a lot about histology and histologic technique from him, and how to do a careful neurological exam. And then in coming to the Mass General, certainly Charles Kubik was the man who influenced me the most.
Now, so how you were at the city hospital for
10 years.
10 years. And during that time, did you develop interest in particular areas in the nervous system?
Again, I tried to work in areas that were not particularly well cultivated, and to change when the problems got too complex for my mind. I started working in cerebral vascular disease with Charles Kubik during that time. We wrote papers on basilar artery thrombosis and so on. And then towards the late 40s, my interest shifted to nutritional disease. We were involved with Merck and Company, Roy Swank and I, and finding out the physiological and pathological effects of pantothenic acid deficiency and pyridoxine deficiency, which had just been produced by Merck and Company. We were working with them in Rahway, New Jersey on swine, and then shifted over to nutrition problems in man, which were largely alcoholic. Alcoholism breeds the best nutritional states that we have in our society.
And a lot of neurologic problems.
And so Morris Victor came along, and we shifted into that and continued that here at the Mass General in the study of thiamine deficiency and so on. And then after coming here, or just before, neuroimmunology was an uncultivated field. And I let my interest shift there, but continued working in muscle disease, which was completely barren.
How did you get an interest in muscle diseases?
I had to look at a lot of muscle at the Mallory Institute of Pathology, and had to teach residents in pathology about this, and finally decided to write a book on the subject with Derek Denny Brown and Carl Pearson.
I guess that was one of the
early books.
Yes. On muscle. And
there had been some way back at the turn of the century, but it was a relatively neglected field. With here, I had the good fortune as chief of service not to have heavy clinical duties like you have. So I could spend half of each day over in the laboratory working in experimental neuropathology, and with Waxman and Barry Arneson
And this
various
was in
people.
the area of immunology then, and in multiple sclerosis. And
That, and
related-
also in the development of experimental allergic encephalomyelitis and the type of immunologic problem involved, and we were able to produce the first forms of experimental allergic neuritis
Mhm.
using very potent antigens from myelin. Waxman and I were working with Jordy Folchpai at the McLean, who was doing the biochemistry. And so that period lasted for 5 or 6 years, and we were writing papers and that, and I was doing all the neuropathology. Then my interest began to shift, and it looked as though the biggest uncultivated area of neurology was in mental retardation. Biggest repository of cases in the country, and the largest number of undiagnosed and often undiagnosable diseases. So that led to the Kennedy labs and the building of the top floors of the pediatric building, the Burnham, and then finally the building of the Shriver Center and the Southard labs out at Fernald.
Which you were in charge of for many
Yes.
years.
From the time it began. The Kennedy Foundation were very generous in providing the money for the building here. Then the state and federal government gave us the money for the labs out there for the prevention of mental retardation. And I retired from that 3 years ago, and Ed Kolodny took it over. We have 60 scientists working there in different fields, biochemical, neuropsychological, and
Certainly, and many publications have come out of
Yes,
that with on new advances and new observations.
and we have screening laboratories for screening populations for disease, and like many other institutes of its kind, I think the frequency of severe mental retardation in this state and others has dropped about 25% in the last 2 decades.
You would ascribe that to several
Screening and various
Education of
prevention methods.
prevention methods.
For example, there's no phenylketonuria anymore. All the children are found at birth here in this state and others. The Tay-Sachs disease, which is limited to the Jewish population. There hasn't been a new case in Massachusetts in 7 years. Kernicterus, which we had numbers of before, has ceased to exist. Things of that sort. We have lysosomal screening labs, and probably the largest population of hereditary metabolic diseases, which was the subject of one of my books.
While we're on that, I'm sorry.
Which has been the product of this institute.
While we're on that subject, what do you see in the future in relation to molecular biology and the various ramifications of gene work?
Well, of course, the large area of mental retardation is still the developmental disorders of the brain. And some of these are based on gene abnormalities, some are acquired diseases, some we have no idea about. And so that's the field of operation for the research is going to be continued at the Shriver Center and with Vern Cavanis, who's now our Kennedy Professor of Neurology at the Charlestown laboratories. The Kennedy labs are moving there, as you know, and in close relationship to the molecular genetics laboratories of Gazella and Joseph Martin.
Really an exciting time
Yes.
in the area. I think your contributions in the light electron microscopy neuropathology have started the building stone on which this next.
Well, it was a necessary series of steps, I think, to get some of these problems out into the open and to begin to think of rational approaches to their prevention, which is what it's all about. You and I know very well that once you have bad disease of the brain, you don't cure it very often. And there are literally hundreds of diseases that we're contending with.
Sorting those out is a real challenge.
Yes, and it's the most exciting field of medicine. I don't think you can have more fun in any field than this.
Well, I think you and I agree on that completely. To backtrack a little, I came to the Mass General in 1955, and as part of the neurosurgical, I came to Mass General in 1957, and as part of the neurosurgical training, we had a rotation on neurology, and we appreciated it at the time, but even more so looking back, to have yourself, C. Miller Fisher, Morris Victor, Charles Kubik, all together in one room every week was just a tremendous teaching experience for all of us. Now, you were able to not only do the research and follow the interest, but you had the overview, for instance, of having Dr. Fisher come and continuing your interest really also in cerebral vascular disease, because you'd made a number of original observations in that field as well, and you continued that in working with Dr. Fisher.
My experience has spanned neurology for about 50 years now, and when I first knew it, it was in miserable condition. Houston Merritt, when I came to work with him, counseled me to get out of the field. There was no future in it. That the surgeons would take over all the tumors, the internist meningitis, and other infections, and that all that would be left, and the strokes no one wanted anyhow, all that would be left would be multiple sclerosis and a few degenerative diseases.
Well, and even the surgeons, Halstead told Cushing he better keep up his general surgical experience because he wouldn't be able to make a living in neurosurgery.
Yes. And so it was quite obvious that if neurology was to develop, that we had to bring in people who had original ideas and who would work in certain defined areas. And so we brought in a series of neurologists, each interested in a particular thing, and it was my view in general that the neurosurgeons had a tremendous part to play in this, that there are certain areas that they knew better than anyone in neurology. It was because of that that we started rotating all of our neurology residents through neurosurgery.
And neurosurgery residents through neurology, and it really, over the years, is one of the very fine things about working here has been the interaction between neurology and neurosurgery.
As long as the residents got along well together, the staff functioned perfectly. And until that time when we began always rotating people from one service to the other, there was strife. Once we did that, it was finished. And that was one very important step. And the other was that once you began to subspecialize in neurosurgery and subspecialize in neurology, if you had a big enough staff, then certain natural affinities between neurology and neurosurgery occurred. You've had some of your best moments with Miller Fisher because of your interest in vascular disease, and I never interfered with that.
Not at all.
And I think others have chosen different fields, and they have found someone in the neurology, neurosurgery with whom they could work. And that has led to a number of very natural combinations so that we share not only interest in categories of disease, but share research interest.
Dr. Adams, you were certainly one of the early people who realized the importance of this subspecialization within a field of medicine. That, of course, relates to some extent to the training of neurologists as well as other neuroscientists. Major changes occurred in training during your period of association with academic neurology, not only in the requirements, the length of time, the association with such fields as psychiatry and neurosurgery, but also the funding of this. And I think it would be of interest to all of us to get an overview.
Yes, actually the National Institute of Neurology began funding residency training programs about 1952 or 3. Neurosurgery was not included. It was considered that they were a very practical specialty, and that the shortage was of highly trained neurologists and psychiatrists. And then that rapidly expanded. We had only 2 residents here when I was a resident, and it was a 1-year program. And we did all the work. We would take calls on alternate nights, alternate weekends, and we didn't work very hard because we didn't see much of the neurology here.
You went to the medical.
Yes, and all the Baker Phillips House cases were out of our domain. And then we gradually began expanding until finally we had 21 residents in a 3-year program. And they were given short periods of exposure to all the different branches of neurology, including children's neurology, which started a training program here in 53 or 4. And that allowed us to, I think, greatly improve the training and to begin to select people that were headed for academic careers. While I was on the council of the National Institute of Neurology, Paul Busey was also one of the counselors. He pled passionately for having training programs in neurosurgery that would also prepare people for academic careers. That was a very important step for neurosurgery. About that time, neurosurgery candidates began to greatly improve, and we, I should say in the last 20 years, we've been attracting superb young people in both neurosurgery and neurology here, 9/10 of whom I think go on to academic careers. There must be more than 200 of them in different parts of the world who have been through this program in some way or other. And of course, having specialties in different areas of research attracted fellows from other university departments, and that enriched our whole program.
Yes, certainly maintaining those research opportunities fostered the program as you described. Now, you mentioned early on your interest in psychiatry, and of course the journal used to be the Archives of Neurology and Psychiatry, and the board used to be Neurology and Psychiatry, and so there was quite an interaction there. But did that separation occur during your
and it occurred during my time and against my advice. When I was first exposed to psychiatry, and when I was on Stanley Cobb's service here, it was completely dominated by Viennese psychoanalysis. You really could not get a job any place in psychiatry unless you would become psychoanalyzed. And it was evident to me at the time that that approach to the study of the major psychiatric diseases would not lead to anything. And the major psychiatric diseases were manic depressive disease, schizophrenia, the anxiety states, and obsessive compulsive neurosis and hysteria. And that the psychoanalytic approach has really contributed very little to the understanding of these. when the psychiatrists insisted on splitting apart neurology, psychiatry, and neuropathology, which form one department at Harvard, this was the idea of the psychoanalyst, who didn't want to have their people measure up to the standards for selection and appointments that we in neurology had used. And I felt it was a sad mistake, because it was just at the moment when psychobiology and the more organic methodologies were developing. I thought it would harm the department, and I believe it has. And I think the dean is now doing his best to try to correct that. To me, schizophrenia and manic depressive disease are as much neurological diseases as a brain tumor.
And are even, I guess, becoming more so with the various biochemical areas now. But what about on the national scene? Is there the same move afoot?
I think so, yes, in the last 15 years. Unfortunately, even with Eric Lindemann here, who is a social psychologist and a psychoanalytic psychiatrist, we never had a rapprochement. And so our services went in their own ways. We insisted that our residents spend 2 months a year, each year, in their second year out at McLean. But they get so much psychiatry here in our service that is merely an embellishment for them. But it's worthwhile. Now I think the moment is right to bring McLean psychiatry and MGH psychiatry together, and both of them should have a part in our neurobiology center here. And they should relate more closely to neurology and neurosurgery. We've argued for that for years.
The current shift in the neuropathology area to the more basic, more molecular area, will that keep the neuropathologist as still a separate department, or will they become more integrated with one of the other basic
neuropathology is a broad field, and there are several different approaches to it. And certainly one approach is to bring brilliant young people who know how to use some of the newer imaging techniques and some of the newer histochemical methodologies from pathology into the field to the study of the basic process of certain diseases. That's at a cellular or subcellular level. And it probably doesn't make too much difference whether you're coming from general pathology or neuropathology. But there's another very important part of it that has to do with diagnosis of human disease. You're dependent upon that all the time.
Every day.
Every day. And so tissue pathology is going to continue to be a very important part of neurology, neurosurgery, and psychiatry, because it maintains the high level of diagnosis and therapy. If you don't have the constant control of tissue pathology, then standards may slip. We don't make mistakes here in this hospital that are not advertised. If you or I make a stupid blunder diagnostically, or if someone does something wrong therapeutically, there are very few occasions when it isn't widely known.
That's no question about that.
Now, the third part has to do with clinical anatomical and clinical pathological correlation. There are just an infinity of disorders of nervous function that can only be studied in the human nervous system. And it requires the most meticulous definition of functional abnormality and the most meticulous study of the anatomical base of that in order to make progress. This is a vast field that's still rudimentary. And if the neuropathologist only knows how to use the electron microscope to study some organelle in a muscle fiber, he cannot make any contribution to this field. And so our thought has been that we need a large department of neuropathology that covers all of these areas.
Broad area.
And that is really at the core of all three services.
I think that's well summarized. Another field that has really come into its own during your period of association with neurology is the neuroradiologist. I can remember the days when the neurologists and neurosurgeons were the neuroradiologists.
Yes. In fact, James White and I were the ones who brought the first neuroradiologist here, and Merrill Sussman. We were out at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences for dinner one evening, and I said to Merrill, who was one of the great neuroradiologists, having worked with Cushing, where could we find a neuroradiologist for the MGH, that we were having to read all of our own films, all of our pneumos and so on. And he looked at me and he said, "Why don't you try me?" I came over here and told Jim White about this, and we invited him the next day. And he was here for 3 years,
Yes.
taking notes, coming to brain cutting conferences. He said there was a lot he didn't know, but he learned fast. And that was the break.
That was the beginning.
And now I think, compared to neuroradiology the way it was when you were resident, and now is just a completely different order of magnitude. It's the most important thing that's happened in neurology and neurosurgery.
It really is crucial to our area. As you look, or as your interests have changed from time to time over the years, you also have devoted quite a fair amount of time to not only writing a book on muscle, but with Dr. Victor writing one of the classic textbooks on neurology, and also being one of the chief editors of the Harrison textbook in medicine. And certainly it must be a great reward to you to be able to have that information imparted to those coming along, but that must take a tremendous amount of effort. How could you kind of work all of this in and run the department and make the clinical observations?
Well, for the reason that I was not encumbered with incessant flow of patients. I was a full-time person, and I could delegate things and also decide on how best to use my own time. Teaching was very important, as is obvious, and one of the ways you find out how to teach is to try to describe what you do, so that the Harrison neurology section and psychiatry, which I did, and the muscle part, were really manifestations of the way we taught these subjects at MGH. So they were constantly being studied and altered in the light of what went on here from month to month.
So you're really putting down on paper what was happening in the day-to-day.
And it not only was easy to do, but it made our teaching better, because we began to see what was wrong with certain things we were doing, and what was the essence of certain subjects that our residents had to grasp. So it was a natural thing to do to write this material up. My writing has been along those lines, and then the others have been monographs and papers on different topics that I was interested in.
Yes, part of your broad background of knowledge. Now, the neurology, as well as the other neurosciences, continues to change, and new areas opening up, such as the combination with neurosurgery and the transplantations for Parkinson's and other illnesses. Would you venture a sort of a summary guess as to what the next decade or longer holds for neurology?
Well, I can only speak for neurology because there I think that this whole area of the chemistry of neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, how they're affected by various diseases that we call degenerative, and how gene products that are now being identified enable us to understand a disease process. I think that's the future of neurology. I'm a little bit skeptical about the transplantation business, I must confess, partly because I'm so overwhelmed by the complexity of the brain. It's just hard for me to believe that putting a bit of tissue in will enable new connections to form that will be effective. The possibility of putting in cells that may be the source of release factors or something in the hypothalamus, I think is certainly conceivable, but it is certainly an unproven matter, even in the Parkinson's business, where they're putting in bits of adrenal gland, which, as far as I can tell, just disintegrate. I don't know whether they're helping or not. Do you?
I don't think we know that yet. What about the training of the neurologist in the future and the overall outlook in terms of what activities the neurologist will be doing?
Well, we've always been involved in training academic neurologists, and that is a very difficult thing to do because you not only have to take good internists and pediatricians who know how to take care of the sick, preferably not taking them too soon, and exposing them to all the different fields of neurology. Then at the same time, and allowing them, either before they come or afterwards, time to master the technology of some field of science that's pertinent to neurologic study, and at the same time to learn how to do research. This takes time.
It certainly does, and should, prior to the individual entering the neurology field, should they have a broad base in medicine, or should they have a broad base in research technique, or both, or
Both.
get that after they embark in the field?
I don't think there's any one way of doing it. Some of the best people have turned into a research area after their residency, having been stimulated by some of the people. And others have already been to NIH for a couple or 3 years, or have done some research in medical school, and already are very well prepared when they come to us as resident. About half of our residents now have a PhD in some field of neuroscience. I don't know that there's one right way. And I don't think you can look at a man and tell whether he's going to be an original thinker and highly productive investigator. If he wants to try, I've always said go to it.
Dr. Adams, we've covered a wide range of points here during this conversation. Were there any further things that you'd like to say?
Only that it's 10 years since I retired.
Hardly seems possible.
And I still am fortunate in being able to see every morning 2 residents and talking about their problems and the new cases that have come in. And I feel that the neurology and neurosurgical services under Joseph Martin and Nick Zervis are probably stronger now than they've been at any time in the history of the MGH. And I'm just delighted to still be a part of it. I'm full of admiration for what's happening.
We're delighted to have you here, and I, in particular, express my appreciation for my association with you since I've been at the MGH, and I want to thank you for spending this time with us.
Most welcome.
I want to thank Dr. Adams for taking the time to be here today. Certainly over the past decades, he has been one of the leaders in American neurology and neuropathology